Have you ever felt like you're not really the one driving? And I don't mean in a car, I mean in your own head. Well, today we are diving deep into the mind's autopilot. We're going to uncover the science of what's called non-conscious agency and try to figure out who or what is really in control when you aren't even paying attention. And trust me, the answer might just change how you think about yourself.
So think about this for a second. Have you ever been driving a familiar route and you suddenly arrive at your destination with no memory of the last few miles? Or maybe you've caught your fingers typing out a password while your mind was completely somewhere else. This isn't just some weird quirk of being human. No, it's a genuine scientific puzzle. How does our brain manage to take action without our conscious say-so?
All right, so what is really going on inside our heads during these moments? Let's pop the hood, so to speak, and really get into the nitty-gritty of our mind's incredible autopilot system.
Look, if any of this sounds familiar, you are definitely not alone. For ages, science has been trying to wrap its head around these moments of unconscious action. But now, there's a really powerful new theory that's giving us a totally fresh perspective, a way to explain everything from our simplest habits to complex planning that happens completely under the radar of our awareness.
And that new perspective comes from something called the Constraint Resonance Emergence Theory, or CRET for short. I know, it's a mouthful, but the core idea is actually pretty straightforward. It suggests that consciousness isn't some thing we have, it's something that emerges. It just happens when different brain signals start to sync up or resonate under just the right conditions. We're going to use CRET as our guide to understanding this whole mystery.
Okay, first things first, we need to get a key term straight. In this theory, when we say autonomy, what we mean is a brief moment where a big picture pattern in the brain becomes self-sustaining. Think of a wave in the ocean. For a second, that wave has its own shape, its own momentum, and it's totally distinct from any single drop of water. That's kind of like autonomy in the brain. The big dynamic just takes over.
To make this even clearer, let's use an analogy. Imagine your brain has a boardroom. This boardroom is what scientists call the global workspace. It's the place where all the really important information gets broadcast so that all the different departments of your brain can get the memo at the same time. Autonomy is basically what happens when that boardroom meeting can run itself for a little while without any new input.
So what's the actual difference between a simple, unconscious habit like tapping your foot and a full-blown conscious thought? Well, CRET proposes this idea of an ignition point. It's literally like an on switch for awareness itself. Let's see how that works. The theory says it all boils down to something called a gain loop. And honestly, the best way to picture this is as a volume knob for consciousness. This knob controls the amount of feedback between our boardroom and all the other circuits in the brain. When the volume is low, you get one kind of behavior, but when you crank that knob past a certain point, well, that's when things get really interesting.
And here it is, that critical point, laid out right here. When that volume is low, below the threshold, you get all these local, isolated processes. These are your habits, your reflexes. You can think of them as quiet side conversations happening all over the brain. But when you turn that volume knob past the threshold, the whole system just ignites. It becomes a global, sustained state. All those side conversations stop, and the official boardroom meeting, what we experience as conscious awareness, kicks off.
Okay, so now that we've got this idea of an ignition threshold, we can finally go back and tackle our original question. What about all that complicated stuff we do without being aware of it? Let's explore the absolutely fascinating world of life below that conscious threshold. And here are some perfect examples of what that life below the threshold looks like. I mean, think about it. Walking, scratching an itch, even those little filler words we all use like or you know. These are all surprisingly complex routines that just run on their own with that volume knob set nice and low. They're autonomous, they're super efficient, and they never have to bother the main boardroom at all.
Right, but it doesn't just stop with simple habits. This is where things get truly mind-bending. Research has shown for a while now that our brains can actually prepare and plan an action seconds before we become consciously aware of our decision to do it. So, how in the world does that work?
CRET gives us a really neat step-by-step model. So first, a plan starts to form in some local brain circuit. You can think of it like a draft memo being written in one department. Then, that plan stays offline. It's a complete idea, but it hasn't been sent up to the main boardroom yet. And finally, when the conditions are just right, the boardroom syncs up with that memo. Ignition happens, and boom, the plan suddenly pops into your awareness as a conscious intention.
What's so powerful about this is how this single theory gives us a totally unified picture. Just look at this table. It shows a whole continuum.
See how as that gain, or feedback, gets turned up, we move from simple, non-conscious reflexes like typing, all the way up through that sort of pre-conscious gut feeling, and finally to full conscious deliberation. It even has a place for dreaming. It's all just different points on the same spectrum of autonomy.
So what's the big takeaway here? What does all this mean for how we think about ourselves, about our own minds? Let's zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture.
What a theory like this really does is it flips a very old assumption completely on its head. We tend to think that consciousness is the boss, right? It's the CEO in our head that directs everything we do. But this model suggests a fundamentally different relationship between our ability to act and our awareness of those actions.
And here it is, the core insight, the idea that changes pretty much everything. Agency, the brain's ability to just do stuff, comes first. That's the default state. Our brains are these incredible machines constantly running all these autonomous processes. Consciousness isn't the starting point for our actions. It's the special, amazing state that emerges from them when the conditions are just right.
I want to leave you with this really powerful quote from the source material, because it just says it perfectly. Consciousness is the critical condensation of autonomy. It's that moment when the system's own activity becomes so interconnected, so resonant, that it becomes aware of itself. You see, it's not the puppet master. It's the moment the puppets suddenly realize they're dancing. Which, of course, leaves us with one last, huge question. If consciousness isn't in charge, then who's writing the script?